broad group of people. Listen, the whole out of the state church movement was broad, it was big, and there were some people who were godly, and there were some people who were dangerous heretics. You remember several years ago, this whole thing that blew up in Waco, Texas, and they sent a bunch of troops in, and many people got killed. And the leader of this whole movement was a man named David Koresh, and his group was known as the Branch Davidians. David Koresh was this charismatic leader who sort of had a spell over his people and commanded this radical, almost insane obedience from them. There were charges of polygamy. There was weird doctrines going forth, and he had sort of this apocalyptic end-time scenario, which ultimately ended up with the death and destruction of his entire group. I'm here to tell you, there were some groups under the label of Anabaptist who were like David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. They were that bad. However, it would be completely unfair to lump them in with other Anabaptist groups who were some of the godliest people ever to walk this earth. And so what I want you to understand is that it's virtually unfair to use one title to apply to everybody who insisted on having some kind of group or some kind of walk with the Lord outside of the state church, outside of the magisterial reformers. But that's sort of the term that we're stuck with. You know, there were some great tragedies in this Anabaptist or radical reform movement. One of them had to do with Luther and the Anabaptist movement that sort of spun out from him, not so much under Karlstadt, but under another man named Thomas Müntzer. You see, many of the radical reformers wanted to change society for the good of the common man. And one of the remarkable events in the wake of Luther's work was the Peasants' War. You see, Thomas Müntzer, who was a priest and a former follower of Luther, became a leader of peasant uprisings. These peasant uprisings had started somewhat spontaneously in 1524, but in 1525 they began to gather more and more steam, and Müntzer put himself at the head of these peasant uprisings. You see, you can only imagine what it was like in those days of virtual medieval slavery, where you had serfs and lords, and where the peasants of the land would sometimes be abused and robbed from and treated horribly. I mean, they had to do everything they could just to be able to have a little bit of food for themselves, while the lords and the aristocracy wanted to take more and more from them. And these sort of peasant rebellions were a somewhat common feature of medieval life. But these peasants in particular in Germany in 1524 and in 1525, they were stirred on mightily by the teachings of Martin Luther. You see, Luther taught them that the Pope wasn't who they thought he was. And that made them think, well, if the Pope as an authority figure isn't who we thought he was, then maybe the Lord who governs over me, maybe my landlord, maybe the nobleman who rules over me, maybe these people. Maybe if everything's going to change in a revolution in the church, then maybe everything should change in society as well, in sort of a revolution all across the board. And so these peasants called on the power of Luther's teaching, and they demanded more just economic conditions, even if that meant the downfall of the authorities. In his preaching, Luther condemned the peasants, and this was a huge disappointment to the peasants who expected him to support them. But in Luther's mind, he said, listen, I only encourage them to free themselves from the spiritual despotism of the authorities, and not from their economic or political influence. But you see, there were men like Thomas Müntzer, again, outside of the magisterial reformers, outside of Luther's circle, members of what we would call the radical Reformation, and he egged the peasants on and saw himself at the forefront of a revolution that would change Germany and Europe, not only spiritually, as Luther had sought, but also economically and politically. And so Müntzer stirred them on. He said to his people, do not be afraid. You are fighting the fight of the Lord. Don't let the blood dry on your swords. In other words, kill that viciously. Well, when the peasants were angry with Luther for not supporting him, Luther was angry right back, and he wrote a very highly charged work titled, listen to the title, Against the Murderous and Thieving Hordes of the Peasants. Well, that title right there lets you know how Luther thought about them. Some historians estimate that 300,000 peasants were involved in this open rebellion, and that 100,000 of them were killed. The war has been called the last great peasant revolt and the first great modern revolution. The peasants were finally defeated decisively on May 15th at the Battle of Frankenhausen. Now, when Luther defended the aristocracy in the peasant rebellion, again, which started very much from ideas based on the priesthood of all believers, the Anabaptist leaders felt incredibly betrayed by Luther. You see, there's some good evidence that Luther, and then Zwingli after him as well, somewhat retreated from positions that they once held when they denounced the Anabaptists. That maybe they moved out the reform to one certain level, one certain distance, and then they realized perhaps we've gone a little bit too far, so let's draw back a little bit. But in that drawing back, it seems that many people were hurt. So, the radical reformers, or the Anabaptists, began as break-offs from the most prominent reformers. And one of the characteristics of them was that they did not mind being known as separatists. This drove Luther and Calvin crazy. Luther and Calvin and other magisterial reform leaders, they wanted it known that Rome broke away from them. You see, this stigma of the separatist, of the one who divides the body of Christ, this was a very heavy stigma in the medieval church, and indeed even to today, but not nearly the way it was back then. But Luther and Calvin and other magisterial reform leaders, they wanted to avoid that stigma at all costs. And they wanted it to be known that if the Roman Catholic Church would have allowed them to stay in, they would have stayed in. They were kicked out instead of leaving. Now, the radical reformers, the Anabaptists, they didn't care. They didn't care one bit being known as separatists. You see, the Anabaptists repudiated these church-state ties. They considered the church to be a voluntary association of committed believers. Now, again, for this very reason, the Anabaptists were not a monolithic movement. They were made up of various factions and groups. It's almost misleading to refer to all these groups outside of the magisterial reformers as Anabaptists, but as I said before, that's pretty much the term that we're stuck with. Of course, Luther denounced them. He denounced them as Schwärmer, enthusiasts or fanatics. While the Anabaptists did get extreme in many places, sometimes with wild prophetic expectations, it's wrong to think of them as being out of step with apostolic Christianity. Generally, they were terribly persecuted on all sides. They were persecuted from other Protestants and from Roman Catholics because, again, they called into question the whole idea of the Christian society where church and state work together. But Anabaptists often showed remarkable courage in their persecution. Generally speaking, we would say that they took the principles that Luther and Zwingli emphasized, justification by faith alone, the authority of the Scriptures, and they took things farther than Luther ever wanted them to because he wanted to be careful to keep political support. You see, the Anabaptists applauded Luther's theology. They only said that he failed in applying it fully. Luther just considered them to be dangerous fanatics and deceivers. But again, I want to remind you that when you believe in believer's baptism, when you believe in a believer's church, when you say that the church should have no control over religious matters, you're talking about things that were radical propositions in the days of the Reformer, and you're talking about your own tie to the legacy of the Anabaptists. Luther certainly had his problems with those who wanted to take the reforming principles further than he intended. But technically, we could say that the Anabaptist movement began in Switzerland in the church of Ulrich Zwingli. As we saw before, in 1519, Zwingli became the people's priest at the great Minster of Zurich and began teaching verse by verse straight through the New Testament. And then all the way from 1519 all the way through 1523, Zwingli taught and reforms were gradually being introduced. It was a wonderful season of Reformation there in Zurich and in other places spreading around in Switzerland. But in 1523, matter of fact, in October, Zwingli proposed changes in the Mass, and he brought these proposed changes before the city council. Zwingli didn't want to move ahead on things unless he had approval of the governing authorities. You can see his state church mentality at work. So when Zwingli brought this before the city council, they said, no, we don't want to make these changes in the Mass. Zwingli said, okay, we won't do them. Then in December, he suggested more changes, but he was refused once again. And again, Zwingli accommodated the refusal of the governing authorities. Now, this greatly bothered some of the people in Zwingli's church who were beginning to think that what the Bible said was more important than what the government or particular religious leaders said. And this was the root of the basic Anabaptist belief that the state was not to be the judge of true religion. So for these believers, the first great issue was adult baptism. A dissenting group right out of Zwingli's church in Zurich, led by a man named Konrad Grebel, wanted to make adult baptism the general practice among the Swiss Reformation believers. He said the Bible nowhere teaches or supports the idea of infant baptism. So the city council of Zurich became aware of their concerns and debated the issue. And they decided on January 21st, 1525, that these believers who wanted to practice adult baptism were wrong and that they should stop insisting on adult or believers' baptism. Well, these men, Konrad Grebel and his associates, these men who wanted to practice believers' baptism, and would do it even if the political powers said no. They didn't agree with the idea that the city council had the right or had the authority to tell them how to obey God. So on the very day that the city council refused them to do this, they went out and did it. That snowy evening in a nearby village, they met and baptized one another.